Welcome to the Dharma of Color, where we interview and support teachers and practitioners of color, and where everybody is welcome. Today we interview Rhonda V. Magee about CRT, personal justice work, sympathetic joy, an appropriate response, and more. For more information about the teacher and the channel, please check the description below, and please enjoy. So is there a time that you're a teacher, you're interested in racial justice? Of course, you're a person of color, right? So that's from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
But was there a time where you were like, oh, mindfulness and racial justice, let's bring them together? Or was it organic and there was no specific time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Blake, and lovely to be with you.
Thank you. Right on.
Yeah. Actually, I can't think of a specific unique time. Instead, I was, teaching law and engaging my own practices. And I had certainly been very aware of how my own practices were supporting me in the work, living in America in this body, cisgender, petite, racialized Black, and having had an arc of experience around impoverishment to, more relative ease economically. Navigating the social terrain, I'd had my own everyday, let's say, opportunities to practice. So, for me, just going through the world in this Black racialized cisgender female body, I just had all kinds of everyday experiences that gave me opportunities to practice, how to maintain a certain ability to keep moving forward, despite the fact of everyday engagements with what we now might call microaggressions or other, threats to my well-being that, in my experience, were coming at me as a result of the kind of physical, the way I look and the assumptions people have, the trainings we have tied to, right, these ways we have of identifying ourselves and others by race, by gender, and so forth. So just my social experiences were giving me everyday opportunities to practice. And that had been so for as long as I had been practicing meditation. And so I was very aware of all of those things intersecting. At the same time, I had, begun to teach law and had chosen to teach these small classes, seminar classes, looking at race and racism in American law. And I say had chosen that because my main teaching was about, personal injury law and insurance law, standard law classes.
Right.
And in fact, I wanted to teach a course that would support students in looking more closely at race and American legal history, drawing on materials that gave rise to what we now know as critical race theory. Right. So it was presenting those materials to our students.
Oh, right. You're in that perfect, unlike other people where like second grade teachers are not teaching critical race theory, but you on the other, I hadn't crossed my mind. You're like, because it's kind of from the legal community, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, very interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. So I was in law school actually when this idea of critical race theory first came on my radar. This would have
Hmm.
been, in 1991. I was a law student at the University of Virginia, and you know, it's Virginia, and as mentioned, opportunities to practice around how my own experience, my own heritage, the things that drew me to law school, by which I mean the desire to kind of do what I might to help keep moving myself, my community, the country forward in the way the metaphor I have of like this forward movement of progress to minimize um, bias, discrimination, oppression based on
Mm.
identities and racism, and to kind of continue the work of dismantling white supremacy. So I'm in law school with those kinds of inspirations, if you will, and of course at University of Virginia at that time, seeing very, very little coming from the other side of the podium in the way of support for really addressing all of these things. We were talking about every other kind of history, but nobody was talking about the history of enslavement in the cradle of the balkanization of race based slavery and other forms of oppression.
Even
That
in an
being,
Ivy League
Mhm.
school, right? It's
Yes,
like, right?
right. One of these
It's like,
public Ivies, right?
right,
We're
right, right.
again talking about every other kind of history pertaining to law and not this in Virginia's
And you're
public
like,
eye.
okay, so this is how the upper class is raised, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was shocking. I mean, partly because of, as you say it just there, anyone would be, but also because I had come to law after having studied graduate sociology. I had been studying non-legal ways of addressing conflict and, um, you know, figuring out how to have a certain lens of sort of awareness, sociological awareness on how to address these things. And so I come to law school, and there's no sense of self-awareness in law, like no awareness that we, in the way that we were teaching, were in every in so many ways replicating the education and the kind of hierarchical structures that we were supposedly also studying to try and dismantle. So that kind of conundrum was very apparent to me, like so many students of color coming along into law, being, among the first or second, really still kind of 1.5 generation of students of color to enter into United States law schools in significant numbers. It's not that there hadn't been prior students of color, but there had always just seemed kind of a little trickle until the civil rights era and the post civil rights era. So that mm, historical moment and my
Right,
place in that. So I come along kind of at the early stages of what had became critical race theory.
right,
People were
right.
starting to publish it. Nobody at my school when I entered was teaching it, although we had one black male professor who saw this coming on the horizon and
Right.
sort of tried to want to get involved somehow. And I became his research assistant
Ah,
for a bit. And I, was a member of the law review. So I was able to write my own paper and finding, and not that it would necessarily be published, it had to go
right.
through a competitive process, but I found critical race theory sources. And it was the thing that enabled me to write a paper that ultimately was published on approaches to reparations theory. Um, it was called The Master's Tools from the Bottom Up, um, the critical responses to reparations theory in mainstream and outsider remedies discourse, right? So I was like, and I wrote this, right, wanting to address these things because it wasn't being dealt with in my law school. And yeah.
I'm glad you're familiar with talking about using the master's tools. I just want to point out how wonderful. I mean, like, thank gosh, like,
Right.
you're
We
familiar
had
with
been
that
meditating on
conversation,
this,
right?
right?
Right.
The we, if you will, have been meditating on this for a very long time.
Right.
And many people don't know this deeper background to my work.
So you were at UVA and you created this. You began the link of teacher of color to student of color, which is so necessary in all types of circles for confidence, for belief, for understanding of what we need to create a thesis or whatever, how we want to develop our communities.
Yeah, I mean, so what happened was I was a student in crisis at law school, like so many students of color then, and frankly, still today, looking for resources that speak to us. I was looking for some resources that spoke to my experience, that recognized and valued it, and not just recognized and valued it, but like could actually help me develop and grow. And that's what I think, gave rise to what is called critical race theory in law, but it also speaks to what gave rise to my own take, which is to bring, mindfulness and this sort of spiritual dimension into this kind of conversation. For me, all the way back then, when I was first kind of grappling with these materials around critical race theory, I was aware that some of the broader materials, which were called critical legal theory, by the way, in other words, critical race theory emerged out of this broader set of criticisms of law that was really about criticizing those embedded hierarchies, not just race, but class in particular, right? So the critical movement was much bigger than race and continues to be wherever it really is doing what it was here to do. But in that broader set of materials, there were materials speaking specifically to the spiritual crisis.
Really?
And this all gets left out of the conversation. Most people never get this deep into what the critique of law was trying to do. So this critical legal theory, which started, by the way, in these Northeastern, Yale, Harvards, within and amongst white males who were the most privileged, going to those schools and saying, wait a minute, what? We're teaching what?
Okay.
And they started writing this critique, and they started saying, it's embedding hierarchy, and it needs to change here. And that then started to draw the few students of color in, because they're like, whoa, the white boys are talking about we need to disrupt hierarchy. We want that.
Yeah, snap.
But the white boys,
sure.
if you will, were not talking about race as much. They weren't talking about gender. And so critical race theory and critical gender theory kind of emerged from that. But what the white guys were talking about, if I may speak in this way, again, I mean, it was a broader, not only white men, but it was started disproportionately by white men.
Okay.
Not surprising, given the demographics. There was a strain of that criticism that was saying this whole system, in addition to embedding hierarchy, and yes, we need to talk more about race and gender, but now we're going to talk generally about class hierarchy in the critical legal theory movement. In addition to that, it's keeping us disconnected it's alienating us from ourselves and from each other, from our deeper sense of who we might be together. It's making us afraid of each other. It's making us feel, I got my rights, you got yours. We're adversaries if we're anything. Like if we're ever going to resolve anything, we have to arm up.
Right.
And so there was this kind of spiritual critique that was embedded in the project. And that resonated very deeply with me. And yet when critical race theory evolved, the spiritual critique was often not brought up.
Interesting.
So connecting those dots was always something I was drawn to.
So when did you start your mindfulness practices? Yeah.
It was after that. So I was in law school doing this. I wrote my article. I got it published. And I named that because without that, I would never have probably had the opportunity to teach law, the hierarchies being the way they are.
Right.
But then I started before, let's see, between graduating law school and starting the practice of law. So
Right.
finishing that article, graduating law school, that summer after taking the bar and starting my law job, I was in this sort of mini crisis around realizing like
I
I
empathize.
cannot rest. Like I've been studying and working and writing and trying to do the thesis and just doing it all. And I was exhausted, in my, early to mid 20s, but already exhausted, and had moved from Virginia to California and was about to start this new career. And it was just really clear that I needed some other way of being in relationship to these new opportunities, this new land of California, this new profession of law that I was entering into with my new job. And it wasn't whatever I needed to support me. I knew it wasn't found in the law books. I knew it wasn't found. I had been trained actually, again, as an indication of so many different things. One of the ways I was able to pay for undergraduate was by taking an Army ROTC scholarship, which may surprise some
Interesting.
people.
Yes.
Certainly, I'm anti-war and quite pacifist now, but it's through having seen as well what Army training is like.
Our
But I'd done
stories are
all of those
complex,
things.
right?
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity there. But I'd done all of these things, and I couldn't really rest and relax. I couldn't, and I knew that somewhere I'd seen the model of being able to self-care, ground oneself, have a devotional practice as a support for doing hard things in the world. And the model that came to mind was my grandmother, who was not a mindfulness meditator, but she had been, raised in the South, in, the century that we associate with some of the worst of the consequences of the resegregation of society, or the re-balkanization of the hierarchies of race in the post-Reconstruction era. My grandma was born in 1906, right when, kind of the restoration of white supremacy was kind of really getting engaged. And so when I come along in the late 1960s, I'm happy to date myself, my grandmother had been called to the ministry, and she was not doing, again, by virtue of that century I just described, she had not had very much education. Her work in the world was the same kind of work, frankly, that women of color in a slave society would be doing. She was cleaning houses for other people. In fact, at that time, really cleaning one house every day. So similar to, again, the slave system, but under a different name. She's cleaning this one family's house every day, 9 to 5, or just being on call and of service, 9 to 5.
So the job never ends.
Exactly, it
Right.
never ends, right?
Yeah.
And that hierarchy was trying not to
Mm-hmm.
ever end, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my grandmother would get up before she had to and spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour in these prayer practices of centering, of, prayer, but then also studying scripture, really reconnecting with a sense of purpose, meaning, and value, and a sense of her agency, notwithstanding the limitations of her life. So this isn't about like a Pollyanna, it wasn't that it was easy. It wasn't that, she didn't every day live at the painful intersections of racism, sexism, classism, and all that it had left in terms of a narrow space for her to thrive.
Right.
But she did live in that space and did the best she could to thrive and model a way of, as she would say, making a way out of no way, right?
Right.
Getting through these hard times that was grounded in self-discipline, self sort of directed commitments to daily practice. And then from there, she was teaching. She had been called to teach on the side. So she didn't have her own church, but weekends were baking cakes, taking them to community, creating a space where other people in the community could thrive. So this is to say that when I came to my little crisis before starting my law practice and started thinking about, well, where have I seen a teacher of a way to navigate these? It was none of these fancy UVA teachers. It was, and it was no, mindfulness teacher of note. It was my grandmother's image. But then I did find a book on mindfulness. So there was that really began the bridge.
Do you remember the title?
Absolutely. So, because again, and it speaks to what you were alluding to before, which is how we come to these practices and the great debt we owe to often under-acknowledged Asian heritage communities of a wide and diverse number of diasporas. For me, my partner, I should say, is not a person who meditates, but his parents were immigrants from India. Mm-hmm. And he's my partner now and was then. And, we were both graduating law school. He had resources and family. They were going off on a big trip. I was there in Oakland by myself because I had come out here and studying for the bar in Oakland and by Lake Merritt, and just like unable to rest, saw he had this book on his shelf. He wasn't reading it, but it was on the shelf. And it was called the Bhagavad Gita for daily living.
Ah, cool.
Right? And it was really written by an Indian immigrant who immigrated to the Bay Area. His name was Eknath Esroran. And he immigrated to the Bay Area and had the specific call to translate practices of meditation and a way of being in everyday sort of mindful engagement with our highest and best. His call was to try and teach that to the Western communities that he was meeting in Berkeley, in the East Bay.
Right.
And so he wrote this book. And my partner, who was from Michigan, found it when he was in Michigan and brought it out here. But this is what was my first introduction to a way of, learning what it meant to meditate. And then thinking about that as a discipline to support engagement in the world. Because right from the very beginning for me, it was about for daily living, for engagement. And here I was about to start a law practice and having written and been thinking about racial justice forever. It was really front and center on my mind that I needed some way of living in a lot of these contradictions and living in this intersectional body and in this new environment in, the East Bay and in California, which was not my original home.
Right.
So I really needed this kind of support, and I found it in that book. But it was a gift of this Indian immigrant and actually an intentional gift to a Western community.
Yeah.
So we see that while it is true that these practices sometimes more often than not perhaps have been kind of appropriated in ways that trouble us, we also, I think, must remember that many of the pathways to our receiving these practices were originated as gifts and originated in this spirit of multicultural kind of engagement, which is like the gift of being in this country and context and in so many other parts of the world where cultures come together.
And it's wonderful. It's slightly tangentially, but it's wonderful that when the gift was given to you, your response was activism and spirituality, right? And we know, the phrase, right, is the personal is political, right? That's always there for, it's not always there, but it's often there for people of color, especially for African Americans, right? Right. Um, a bunch of stuff comes up for me. And also, I think for our generation, I think about this often. For our generation who were in college in the 80s and
Mm-hmm.
90s,
Mm-hmm.
we really, uh, the wave of awareness
Mm-hmm.
and Black Power and people of color power was crashing, and it crashed on us in
Yeah.
academia, and we were so
Mm-hmm.
lucky to have that, because it kind of, and of course that was true in hip hop as well,
Mm-hmm.
and in poetry and in
Mm-hmm.
many areas of the arts. And so I want to sort of check in with you on that. So let's move into the rituals that you've created from this need to step forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, of course, understanding emptiness is central idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the question for new and older practitioners is, well, do I have to get rid of my identity? Right, or something like that. And our identities, for better or for worse, are sometimes that they support us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is, of course, goes around in all different communities.
Yeah.
This idea, especially those who are investigating mindfulness and Buddhism. It seems paradoxical, but your strategies, well, let's look at this identity. And so I don't want to create problems where there are none, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rhonda, but could you go ahead and maybe talk about, like, well, that seems counterintuitive, you
Right,
know?
right, right. Well, thank you
You're
for
welcome.
that. It's really such a good question for, mm, for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I think of the Heart Sutra, I think
Mm-hmm.
of these
Mm-hmm.
deep teachings
Mm-hmm.
that invite us to, yes, reflect on and bring insight to concepts and to the conditioned nature of things, including the sense we have of ourselves and the sense we have of ourselves that we've inherited through the lens of these concepts, race and racism, and so on.
Right.
Other kinds of isms and identities intersect, of course. And so, yes, we think of the path of liberation and the kind of, if you will, goal of it all to some sort of empty freedom from, right? But of course, ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
I think we're invited to see even the temptation to get hooked on the idea of something called emptiness. In other words, that too is a concept.
Indeed.
And
Yeah.
ideally, we are given to see all things as being beyond duality, so that the form, the construct of race is emptiness, just as whatever we're calling emptiness, it shows up in those forms. So if we are avoiding looking at the form,
Right.
we're missing an opportunity to see emptiness in a certain sense. We're missing a pathway to a fuller understanding, a deeper insight into the nature of these different dimensions of reality that we're experiencing in the world. So for me, looking at race is a doorway to liberation. It's seeing that concept as kind of a trip that we're on, whether we want to be on it or not. And it's really it's inviting us to understand a little bit more about how, through kind of being more aware of those kind of parts of the trip that are hard for us to look at, that we don't feel comfortable with, that we are trying to liberate ourselves from. How all that entire range is absolutely available to teach us something about clinging and emptiness.
It reminds me of, well, it doesn't remind me, but the multiplicity of experiences that you bring forth in your book was touching and is touching and so important. It speaks to your experience, and it creates this universe of, or constellation or whatever, or community through the voices that you bring forth. Everybody has something to share, and you bring it forth in both your teaching and, of course, the book. And so, and often, not only do you tell the backgrounds, but the stories that they have. And so, could you talk about bringing forth voices, the importance of voices, and perhaps the stories, storytelling as process and pedagogy?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all, again, every one of us has these experiences that teach, that can illuminate, enlighten. And so, yeah, thank you for naming that aspect of the book that is very much about the pedagogical content and journey that a certain kind of storytelling can open up for us. It's a kind of learning, again, like all things, operating on multiple dimensions. What are the stories we're telling ourselves? Are we, so opening up a kind of spiritual, contemplative, mindful, whichever word works better. Some words work better for some than others, but opening up some dimension of perspective on the stories that we say are ours is one part of the practice.
Right.
So what are the stories that I tell? And, that spiritual dimension is inviting a kind of spaciousness, a kind of recognition that it is a story, it is a representation of something. That's the big question. What is it representing? What is it representing? And what's that gap between reality and the representation that our stories present? In other words, just recognizing that the stories we carry, they have something of what we will call that truth of it. It's our story. But if we are honest and we're really aware, we can see that we construct the story. We choose what to emphasize and what not. And like all humans and all creators, by virtue of the media, if you will, the time constraint, whatever the necessities of editing, we're picking and choosing what to highlight. We're not necessarily telling the whole story.
How do
we never can, in fact, right?
Indeed, because time.
Yes.
How do we hold the fictional part of especially when it's reflected to us sometimes, if we're lucky, right? How do we deal with that?
Right. So already my hand's going up to the heart.
Right? I see. Yes,
and right,
yes.
One of my readers for my book said, I was reading your book and I just felt like the word compassion was coming up so frequently and I was feeling that. And so this particular reader did a search on Kindle or whatever and saw that like the word compassion appears in these, 300 pages, more than 700 times.
Right.
So more than twice a page. So compassion is really, I think, so critical to my answer as I'm forming it to this question, as it is critical to how I see this work of being these soft belly, carbon based beings
Right, right,
in
right.
relationship to this beautiful planet, right? Being these beings who are in this social world, which, you know, has embedded in it certain, let's say, kind of demands, challenges to be legible and to read and to be readable in the social context, to be understandable. Like
Yeah,
we're going to talk about our experiences. We're going to tell these stories. So I think part of what mindfulness has helped me to be able to do is to kind of deepen my ability, and it's of course an ongoing process. I'm all in it right with you all,
right.
but deepen that ability to kind of um, recognize the multidimensionality of experience. That how it is that I engage in the world is never going to be the whole story. What I'm able to speak about or share is never going to be the whole story. It's never going to be the whole truth. Um, what comes from that? Humility. But and that dance of like some humility, but also some sense of the importance of being present and having a voice, and setting boundaries when we're not being respected. In other words, this is where everything we're talking about kind of amps up the level of, to me, it invites more from us in terms of skillful means of navigating, this carbon-based life with all of these other, other forms of life and the temptations that come with it to cling to some particular kind of aspect of the story that we really like, and then to maybe cling a little bit more to any way that we're being rewarded for this part of the story that we really feel good about. So bringing that kind of skillfulness into our way of being in relationship with all things is what I think the practices can support us in doing. But that includes, of course, how do we skillfully engage around, the reality we have social identities. Whether we want to have them or not, we live in a world where, unless we retreat to a cave somewhere and never come out, um, we're going to be in the process of meeting other human beings on the social realm. So it's to me, mindfulness can invite a waking up to
Right.
how we might choose to be in relationship to ways of presenting ourselves in social contexts, how we might choose to kind of be engaged in that, but not lose sight of the ever-present threat that we might um, do some harm to ourselves and to others.
Yes, we that calls for a lot of heart-centered work, right? Because as we know, we've done harm, especially as you get older. You're like, you, right? Um, could you,
Yes.
could you, and we have to carry those things around. I've noticed with my own self spending, not a lot of time, but at least when I hit my 40s, like going back and finding people and saying, I'm sorry I did this, like I was not, you know, that was me ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
Following up with what you were talking about.
Yeah, we all have had those reckonings.
Uh-huh.
The reckoning begins here. This to me is why these practices are really a wise, set of, you might say, personal infrastructure, or I sometimes use the phrase personal justice work, um, as a support for that interpersonal and collective systemic justice work we want to do. Like if we are not willing to look at how we are and what, the energy, the ultimate kind of intentionality now, and also minding the, reality that there is often a gap between intention and impact. But really having this sort of, let's call it for now, ethical or moral, right? This understanding that our actions do matter in the world. The words we use, how we speak, every aspect of it matters. And and without, giving ourselves too hard a trip or too big right, to freak us out too much about the responsibilities we carry, to recognize that, yeah, we'll make mistakes and, we can begin again in any moment.
Yes. The
right?
beginning again.
Every moment we can begin again with love. Because to me, that's what the practices are ultimately inviting us. When I speak about what they're inviting us to do in the soulful realm, it's like to recognize that, life is precious and tremendously much more fleeting than we realize. And by the way, none of us know when it's going to end.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these kind of preliminaries, if you will, traditionally taught as some of the preliminaries in Buddhist practice. Life is the impermanence of life, the preciousness of it, the fact that our actions do matter, and then all of that as a way to invite us into a kind of set of commitments for how choosing to act with intention, and to be in that kind of practice of like, I had an intention, I did this thing, how did it impact? Oops, what am I willing to do next? How can I begin again? So that to me is about like bringing mindfulness to skillful interaction. It's not the whole story of mindfulness, but as we as socially embedded beings work together, it's so important that we are really, I hope for my own self, I'll just say, my hope is that I am always kind of doing what I can to make real whatever insight I have about the nature of reality, but also about how that, as they say, the ocean and the drop are one, how all of that is showing up in how am I listening to this other person? How all of that is showing up in how am I deciding what my particular role in this movement might be, even if for now the role is to pause, to study it a little bit more before taking action.
It brings up the concept of courageous conversations. And I can see, especially in mixed company or white majority circles, how valuable that investigation is and will be and has been. I really enjoy the idea of responding rather than reacting. That's so valuable. And this notion that you were speaking about, alluding to and directly speaking about, which is the appropriate response. And this is so key, right? It's so key for all of us to cultivate. And of course, let me just reiterate the importance of self-compassion that enables us to get into these conversations that are difficult for people of color for clear reasons, and difficult for non-people of color for clear reasons, right? And it's again, I don't want to create any kind of dichotomies, but there are people of color who are used to talking about this and used to having the labor of having to talk about this. And there are non-people of color, there are white folk, European Americans who are used to being silent about this, right? And so how can we enter the stream? How does this make us, why do we want to do this? And so anyway, and I want to also go all the way back to the conversation and just acknowledge the importance of our ancestors and our parents and our grandparents, right? And those people that didn't have access but were wise. I hear from time to time, I hear this, learning things at the kitchen table, and I just want to, say ashe and say we recognize you, right?
Thank you so very much.
Yes. So a couple things before we go. In this conversation, we have these conversations, especially mindfulness and dismantling racial oppression, or from the inside out. And you, in your book, you say, how can we have these conversations, or we can have these conversations without re-traumatizing, but with a constant sense of joy? And that is really attractive. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Yeah, I've really been meditating on this for the last few weeks with a particular kind of focus, because it's really hard to do this right now, or to even talk about this sounds naive, doesn't it? Right now, in some ways, it can.
Well, I don't know. It's so wonderful. It's beyond
right.
naive, right?
Yeah, right. It's like, wow, okay, let's do this. Right. So yes, it is reminding me, and I'm a lifelong student, right? So I'm studying interpretations of some of the early sutras, Buddhist scriptures, if you will, that speak to how it is that we come to an approach to mindfulness in the West that tends to be very individually focused on how the mind is operating, only maybe eventually, often not right at the front end. Some point later do we get into the heart practices. Maybe a little bit later do we get into compassion and self-compassion practices. It's changing a little bit. But a lot of what has been taught as mindfulness has centered so much on, and in a helpful way, this is not to say right or wrong, but just to say that there's a way that Western teachings around mindfulness have kind of launched us into, what's my personal, what kind of personal suffering am I trying to disrupt right now? And how can these practices be a lifeline? And again, thank goodness for, the way in which the Four Noble Truths has been like that bridge to folks who are suffering, that bridge that has helped so many people say, oh, there may be something here for me. Maybe practicing mindfulness can support me in healing and all of that. A lot, though, of what I'm also encountering as I read, teachers like Bhikkhu Nalio, who's a student of the early Theravada sutras and beyond, his teachings on the Brahma Viharas, on the the immeasurables that are said to flow from the practice. Compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Those explorations are examining how metta, loving kindness, traditionally really was about just recognizing the love and warmth that exists in our own body and being, and inquiring, can we feel that? Is that something we already can just feel in our body and being without having to cultivate an image of a benefactor or a person, which is feeling it in the heart space and just feeling the life energy within us and kind of allowing the warmth or whatever it feels like for you and for me as a person. What does it feel like? Describe that. Does it have a vision, a color? can we feel the emanation of that? It's almost like an energy, like our version of the sun
Right.
that's in us.
Right.
In other words, it's sort of less conceptual. There's still concepts, obviously. You can't speak without using concepts, but a way of thinking about compassion and metta and the role it may play in our being with these difficult matters, that recognizes that some of this is just innate to who we are. If we get out of our way, if we can reattach to it, maybe we didn't get enough mirroring of that as infants. Most of us didn't get quite as much as we would like.
Right.
Maybe, right, our culture, the society we live in disconnects us from the sense that we have this innate goodness. But I feel very drawn to, and I think I always have, if I look at my history, my own experience as a child, I've just always been somehow able to feel that that we are much more like this worthiness, this sort of inherent belonging in this sense of our radiant goodness.
Right.
It's just something that I feel like I've been in touch with. And so when I think about how these practices can support us, it really is about first helping us all embed. And in fact, I'm offering a retreat coming up at Spirit Rock, just to say, in a couple of weeks, that's about metta, loving kindness as a support for justice and these efforts to engage around issues of injustice. So really grounding in and reorienting ourselves. How do we relate to this idea of loving kindness? What for many of us, it's in the West, and however we enter into this sense of our identity, just emanating kindness and love or feeling that for ourselves doesn't necessarily come naturally. It can really be something that is hard. And I get that. I'm working with people from different experiences, and I hear oftentimes people will say to me directly, private chat me online now, I've never had the experience of feeling safe. I've never had the experience of feeling like it's okay for me to just open my heart. So many of us, in other words, are carrying some deep woundedness, some deep feelings of, again, that sort of separation from our sense of belonging and worth and goodness and safety. And so, of course, if we're feeling separated from that, the idea that we can offer that to people who look like those who have harmed people who look like me, right?
Right.
So it's like it's really not easy, and it's often not given space, right? We were often not given the space to kind of do the healing work that we need.
I know that I'm thinking a lot of Lama Rod Owens, who's like, it's like hammering away with this notion of we need to grieve. But through this grieving process, right, there is joy, and there is enjoy, right, in engaging, right, because of yeah.
I mean, and it's counterintuitive, and it's not like it's no one thing, and it's not one size fits all. It's not going to look the same for me as it will for you, my dear. Each of us, right, has our own journey around this. But I'll just say, for example, just yesterday, I had the good fortune. I've been trying to cultivate in my own one of my little mini areas of practice is how am I in relationship with my neighbors.
Right.
So a neighbor has a 1-year-old boy, a corona period baby, that we haven't had a chance to see very much of because of this time. But who just had a birthday, and we were invited to kind of figure out how to have a birthday party for this 1-year-old and see each other. And so I went and visited with the family and their extended family. And it's just this joyful, I think we didn't even really fully articulate all the joy that's there, but it's coming out of like, we have made it through and this new form of life is here and here's his little friends are here, and all of that was beautiful, and I was so grateful to be present to it. But also, just to say, this part of my own journey I haven't brought into the conversation very much in my teaching anywhere. I am a person who doesn't have my own children. I wanted my own children very much, actually, right? So it wasn't like I was indifferent or didn't want children. It was the opposite. I very much wanted my own children. And so I, like millions of other women alive today, and goodness knows throughout history, have had the experience of this particular kind of grief that's around infertility as a woman. And it's a kind of a grief that I'm past the age now where it would even be possible, really, except for the Janet Jacksons among us, right? I'm past that age, but still, it's a kind of thing that when I'm around the babies, I can still feel, or later, I can still feel that sadness. I can still feel that grief. So for me personally, even though I've been practicing for, 30 years and now teaching, etc., these ways in which just this being human, this having a broken heart, this like being in a moment where surrounded by the joy and sympathetic joy, truly feeling the sympathetic joy of this family's appreciation of this new life. And then when I came back to my practice and sat for a bit and just allowed myself to kind of be in the feeling and the river of this experience, what was also there was this additional wave of a bit of the grief of my own, the whole set of the story I have in my head of what it might have been if I had my own kid, and what our parties, it can all come. The tears softly came. So I say that to say that there is, and it was being held with this, ultimately, with this gentleness around, yes, of course you've got a broken heart around this. And you're alive.
Yeah.
Let's not miss the gift of this life. Let's not Pollyanna, let's not sort of say, we've got to turn this hard thing immediately into something positive. And yet, the truth is, if I had had the life that I imagined and wanted so much and think I would have wanted,
right,
this particular life wouldn't have looked like this. I don't know what it would have been. And so surrendering to a sense of equanimity, even as we grieve, even as our hearts are going to be broken 1,000 times, but at the same time, not missing. We actually are incredibly in a universe filled with so much beyond imagination, really. We happen to be able to be here. We happen to be able to watch this little one, and the joy of these young life, precious forms of life in our midst. This all has to be met in not one thing, right? So not being lost in the grief, but not minimizing, pretending it's not there, and only seeing the joy. That's what these practices can help us to do.
And I must add, as a teacher, I take great joy in having my English students, because I also do not have kids, okay, you are my family in a sense, right? And your woes, this is our opportunity. And and then of course in the Sangha, taking fortunately we have people, youngsters and oldsters, and everybody in between as our family.
Precisely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's being open to that reframe of what family is, and being open to receiving that truly as family, so that the attachment to loss, if not completely, right, we might still want to look, right? Like, that's part of my story. But at the same time, it's like, but isn't there also this actual story of this family that you do have, this rich family? For me, like you know, years and years of engagements, decades of engagements with beings and light, you know, beautiful lives and right, beyond measure. So it's really, again, what's my perspective on all of that? How do I notice the way I hold it, notice the kind of true dimensions of that, if you will, but also that I'm capable of holding that story in such a way as to churn distress or not. All of that rests with me.
Well, with that, Rhonda, I want to thank you so much for your time, right?
Thank you, my dear. It's been a complete joy.
Yeah, right
I
on.
really, really appreciate it.
Right on. Have a wonderful day. And we have a lot more to talk about. So in the future, and I will see you.
Yes,
Yes.
may it be so, my dear.
All right. Peace.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Peace. Yes.